we have seen demonstrated in front of us for the past 10 years, and certainly for the past 2 years, that we used to think Russia's military was 10 feet tall. Well, we got that wrong, didn't we? Russia's military may be 5'5" or something like that.
We're talking about Russia this evening and the leaking of those documents from Russia, which suggest that the trigger, the nuclear trigger, as far as Russia is concerned, is far more sensitive. They are ready to fire nuclear weapons far sooner in a conflict than anyone really imagined. Let us talk to General Philip Breedlove, who's a former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO from the USA. Hello to you, General.
Hello to you, John. Good to be back on your show.
It's good to have you back, General. You've seen these reports. They seem to be credible. I had an authority from the International Institute for Strategic Studies who felt this looked pretty authentic and felt it was astonishing. Tell me, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think a couple of things jump to mind, and we're not going to be totally sure of why this happened, but there's a few things that track with our history with Russia and these issues. First of all, we, in the beginning of this Ukrainian conflict back in 2014, and I remind all that this conflict's been going for 10 years, vice 2 years, which is what you hear in the news these days. But, 10 years ago, we told Russia before the war started what we were afraid of. We identified that we didn't want a wider war in Europe. We identified that we would take every measure to avoid nuclear weapons. And then we went on to tell them a bunch of things like, we're not going to put up caps. We're not going to put any boots on the ground. We were in a big rush to tell Russia what we would not do and what we were afraid of. And on the nuclear issue, what we've seen since that time is Russia continually plays back to us things that would stoke and continue our fear about nukes. If we really examine the last 10 years, we will find that a senior policymaker in the Russian apparatchik almost weekly talks about a nuclear subject. Abrogating this treaty, we're not going to do this. If they give them tanks, we're going to go nukes. All of these nukes to keep this foremost on our mind.
Yeah.
So the first thing I would offer in relation to this release is this could be just another one of those points where Russia wants to keep foremost in the mind of Western leaders who have taken counsel of their fears on this subject, that Russia is willing and able and at the hair trigger to do it. In the second case, I would just offer very quickly that we have seen demonstrated in front of us for the past 10 years, and certainly for the past 2 years, that we used to think Russia's military was 10 feet tall. Well, we got that wrong, didn't we? Russia's military may be 5'5" or something like that, because they have performed extremely poorly in Ukraine. And so this is maybe a clear indication that Russia has known all along that they had limitations of their conventional capabilities, and therefore might need to be quick to the trigger,
right,
with nukes.
So you'd argue that that since the invasion of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, we in the West have encouraged Vladimir Putin to believe that he can count on the West to lack steel, to lack backbone, and if he were to take the initiative in a fight with the West by fighting tactical nuclear weapons as the first use of those nuclear weapons, it would be the West that backed away. We've encouraged him to believe that's possible. That's what you're suggesting. Look, what about the way the
I would use a little more technical term.
Yeah.
I would say that we in the West are deterred. The great thinkers, the Clausewitz, the Jomini's, the Sun Tzu's, they tell you seize and hold the initiative and deter your enemy and not allow your enemy to deter you.
Yeah.
Well, we in the West are deterred by Mr. Putin's threats of nuclear war.
Right. So look, if we look at what is happening now then in Ukraine, where Ukraine are still putting up a stiff resistance, they are still getting a lot of support from the West. We know that support is running a bit thin. We know there are worries on the Ukrainian side where in parts of the battle running out of ammunition and so on. But there is still that support. Do you think that will have led the Kremlin and led Vladimir Putin to change his mind about the weakness of Western resolve?
Well, I'd like to take this a little differently. One of the reasons I see this release or this leak or something happening now is maybe tied to what President Macron said in the past several days. All of a sudden, there's a discussion among some in NATO that boots on the ground are not off the table. Remember, as we talked just moments ago, one of the things that we were in a headlong rush to tell Russia that there would be no U.S. and no NATO boots on the ground. And why we did that, I will never understand. Why we would take that off the table at the very beginning doesn't ring very strategic to me. And I think Macron is trying to introduce a little concern in the mind of Mr. Putin.
Yeah, I mean, would that have worked? Because as soon as President Macron of France said what he'd said, it was pretty much repudiated by everybody, other leaders, by NATO itself.
Again, we seem to be in a rush to tell the enemy what we won't do. And that very much changes his decision calculus, doesn't it? It makes it much easier for him when we assure him of the things that we are not going to do.
But would you say then, if it came to war with Russia, heaven forbid, but if it came to war with Russia and Russia did this, acted on these plans and engaged in a first strike using tactical nuclear weapons, would that lead to an immediate response in kind from NATO and the West, do you think, General?
Well, I'm not going to speak for NATO. It's been a long time since I've been there, but I would tell you that we certainly have thought about the ability to respond rapidly in kind. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. I mean, one can also, if I could put another question this way, when you look at the argument that's taking place in NATO, including across the Atlantic, well, you might imagine Russians would look at the conversation in America on one side of the aisle, which is reluctant to support Ukraine. They might think it's possible to deter America from entering a war on the continent of Europe, especially, I guess, if there's a change of president and Donald Trump becomes president.
So, John, I don't do politics. I think you and I have had this conversation before. So I'm going to answer a little different question than you asked. I think that America's commitment to NATO is ironclad. Remember that we have had that president for 4 years before, and there were great fears about what that individual might do, and none of them came to fruition. We are still in the alliance, and the alliance is stronger than it's ever been. And thankfully, we'll be welcoming Sweden into the alliance very quickly. And adding both Finland and Sweden in the north has made this alliance eminently stronger than it was before. These are two extremely capable militaries who have practiced with NATO for a long time. They are completely compatible. Their tactics, techniques, and procedures are the same, et cetera, et cetera. So I see the alliance as strong as it's ever been. I don't see America pulling out of the alliance. You see politicians working in their various ways to assure that, reminding folks that in America we have three portions to our government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, and each of them play their own part in these huge policies about what America will or will not do.
Right. Thanks for sharing your opinions with us, General. That is General Philip Breedlove, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Now let's talk about millennium.